Hello, Rabbi.
Hi, you're welcome. Welcome back to the daily Rambam class. We are beginning a new section today. We are learning Psulei Hamukdashin, which is chapter 1 of disqualified offerings. It's Thursday after all, so let's just see where we are up to in the Rambam. Mishnah Torah is the name of this massive compilation of the Rambam. And we are in book number 8, Sefer Avodah, Temple Service. The average guy that calls himself Frum, if you bumped into him on the street, you'll find yourself probably a lot more knowledgeable than him, because the Shulchan Aruch does not include any of the laws relating to the Beis Hamikdash, which we will have, please God, very soon. But through the study of Rambam, obviously the Gemara as well, but through the study of Rambam, you get to cover every section of Jewish law. And now we are learning about the Beis Hamikdash, and our sages tell us that by studying about the Beis Hamikdash, it's considered as if we are building it. So we merit to see all of this, not just in study, but in practice very soon. As I said, we're in chapter 8, book number 8, Book number 8 has 9 subjects, 95 chapters. These are the 9 topics. We're almost done. We learned about the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, the Beis Hamikdash. We learned about the utensils. We learned about entering the temple. We learned about forbidden offerings. We learned about how to bring offerings. We learned about the daily and added offerings. That was over the last 10 days. And today, with the help of Hashem, we begin Psulei Hamukdashin, things that are disqualified in the Beis Hamikdash, or disqualified offerings. There are 19 chapters, which means that we will be busy with this for, please God, the next approximately 3 weeks.
Hey, okay.
Just so you know what's coming your way. So these are the 19 chapters. Today we're going to learn about when an animal is disqualified in the way it was shafted. Then we'll learn about if the animal is disqualified in what was done with its blood. When an altar is shafted on the altar or off the altar, should it be brought down from the altar? Once it's on, is it there to stay? What happens to the animal when it is disqualified? What happens if the money's got mixed up, or the animals got mixed up and you don't know what's what? What about birds? What about the flour and the bread offerings that were disqualified? There are a full 5 chapters, 6 chapters that speak about thoughts. Thought plays a key role in getting atonement and bringing an offering to Hashem. So we're going to spend about a week talking about our thoughts, and then, or at least in temple times, hopefully soon. And finally, when an animal is disqualified and it needs to be burned, not offered as an offering, but it needs to just be burned. So that's what's coming our way over the next 19 days. But for today, let us begin with the laws of disqualification that come about through shafting. Please bear with me one moment while I check on my baby. He also wants to participate in the Rambam class. This is Mendela.
Hello.
Okay, here we go. We've got a big number in front of us. I believe over 30 halachas today. Before we get into the halachas, let's look at the mitzvahs that will be covered in the next 19 chapters. The laws of Psulei Hamukdashin, disqualified offerings. There are 8 mitzvahs, 2 positive mitzvahs and 6 negative mitzvahs. And they are not to eat offerings that have become unfit or blemished, not to eat an offering that is vile. We'll learn exactly what that means. It means that it was disqualified in what was thinking, not to leave the offerings beyond the time of their consumption, as specified in the Torah. Every offering has a limit. If you look at the beginning of the Siddur, we have the morning prayers before Baruch She'amar. We have a few pages that describe exactly how each of the offerings should be eaten in 1 day, in 2 days, 1 night, 2 nights, 3 days, etc. Not to eat what has been left over of the sacrifice beyond the specified time, not to eat sacrifices that have become unclean, meaning tameh, that a man who has become tameh, unclean, shall not eat of the sacrifices, to burn whatever is left over, and to burn whatever has become tameh. Those are the, not 18. Those are the 8 mitzvahs that we'll be discussing in the next 19 chapters. And now for chapter 1. Anybody disqualified from performing sacrificial service, anybody who has any kohen who has been disqualified from bringing an offering or from serving in the Beis Hamikdash, may shecht a korban, may slaughter a sacrifice, even sacrifices of the most sacred order, and even as an initial preference. So even if a person has been disqualified, he still can be the sheichet for even the highest level korban, with the exception of somebody who is tameh. If somebody is ritually impure, then he may not shecht at the outset, even though he stands outside the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash and inserts his hands and slaughters inside the courtyard, he is still not allowed. Why? We're worried that he might actually touch the meat and then disqualify it. If he is tameh, you can make the meat tameh too. So again, any kohen can shecht the korban. In fact, I think not only a kohen, I think even a regular Jew would be allowed to shecht the korban. Now, if somebody who is tameh did shecht an animal, we said he shouldn't. If he did, the animal is kosher. It's acceptable. Similarly, with regards to the bull brought by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest on Yom Kippur, even though the Torah says an Aaron shall slaughter it, if a non-Kohen shechted it, it is acceptable. In fact, even the red heifer, which had to be kept to the highest level of purity, if it was shechted, if the para aduma was shechted by a non-Kohen, it is acceptable. For there is no shechting by a non-Kohen that makes it unacceptable. So everybody is allowed to shecht the animal with the exception of somebody who is impure, and even that is just a rabbinic decree so that he doesn't make the animal impure. Now, when a person shechts the animal, but didn't intend to do so, he's just busy, thoughtlessly. So he just happens to be fidgeting with a knife, a shchitza knife. I don't know exactly how this works out. And he's like, oh, wow, I just shechted the animal. So if his intention wasn't to shecht it, then the animal is disqualified. As we will see when it comes to a korban, intention, thoughts play a primary role. You must have the intention to shecht them. You're not allowed to shecht 2 animals at once. If you lined up the 2 necks, one right next to the other, that had a super long knife and managed to shecht them both at the same time, then at the outset, he's not allowed to do so. But if he did, the animals are acceptable. Okay. So he says, interestingly, that this is a special law with regards to offerings. If it wasn't an offering, if it was just a regular animal, then on principle, halachically, a sheikh is allowed to shecht two animals at once if he makes sure that they're both done correctly. Today, this is certainly not practiced. Two people may shecht an animal together, joint operation. I don't know if you call it an operation or anyhow. It's something wonderful. It's bringing an offering to Hashem. So if two people shechted the animal together, then they can shecht it, and it is acceptable. A minor is not allowed to shecht a sacrifice, even if he's being watched by an adult, which would be acceptable for a regular korban. And the reason is that a korban requires concentrated intent. Again, we said we need thoughts involved, and a minor does not have such a potential. We don't count a minor's thoughts. Even when a minor's deeds indicate that he is acting with intention, he is not considered to have acted with intention if that will produce a leniency, only if it will produce a stringency. So we say we'll bear the minor's thoughts into account to make things worse, but not to make things better. How so? If an animal to be sacrificed as a bird offering, as a korban oila, was in the south, and a minor led it and brought it to the north, and then he shechted it, so his actions indicate that he intended to slaughter a sacred animal. So the fact that he moved it to the right part of the base of Mikdash shows that he knew what he was doing. His mind was in the right place. He had the right intention. It's still disqualified. He doesn't give an example of the other way around. He says that we don't allow the thoughts of a minor to make things better, only to make them worse. So here it made it worse. When sacrifices of the most sacred order were slaughtered in the southern portion of the courtyard, or their blood was received there, they are disqualified because they were brought to the wrong place. Again, in Eizahul B'Kayman, the beginning of davening in the Siddur, what does Eizahul B'Kayman mean? Eizahul B'Koman Shel Zvachim. Where is the place of the offerings? And we continue to enumerate where each offering was brought. So the first we speak about is B'Tzafon, that they are offered in the north. So each animal needs to be in the right place. If a person was standing in the south and he extended his hands into the north and shechted the animal, then the offering is acceptable, as long as the animal itself was sacrificed in the right place. Even if he wasn't there, then that's fine. If by contrast the kohen was standing in the south and he extended his hands into the north and received the blood, then that's disqualified. That's unacceptable. So we'll learn that there are different steps in the offering. The first step was for the animal to be shechted, and the next step would be for the blood to be received and then sprinkled on the altar. So if the person receiving the blood was not standing in the right place, then that offering is disqualified due to the blood being received in the wrong place. Even though his hands were in the right place, his body wasn't. If he brings his head and the majority of his body into the northern portion of the temple courtyard, then, although his feet are still in the south, if most of his body in the north, then that is acceptable. Excuse me. Now, if one slaughtered an animal in the northern portion, and then in the convulsive movements that accomplished its death, meaning when the animal shaked after being shechted, it moved to the south. Or even if the kohen thereafter took it to the south, it's acceptable. As long as at the moment of the shechita it was in the north, even if a split second later it jumped into the south, that's fine. If after these convulsive movements movements took it to the southern portion and then it returned to the northern portion, the blood was received there, it is acceptable. So we said that it needs to be shechted in the north, so gesund, and the blood needs to be received in the north. If in the meantime the animal jumped into the south, that's not a problem. Similarly, if animals to be slaughtered as sacrifices of a lesser degree of sanctity, were inside the courtyard and one was standing outside the courtyard, so if it's a higher level of sanctity, then it has to be in the north and not the south. If it's a lower level of sanctity, the korban can be shechted anywhere but it needs to be inside the courtyard and not outside the courtyard. So now we apply the same principles. If the animal was on the inside and you were on the outside, and you just put your hand in and shafted it, that's fine. We said that we look at where it is actually shafted. But if you receive the blood while you're standing outside, then it's unacceptable, even though your hands are inside. Even if your whole body was inside the courtyard and just one lock of hair was still on the outside, it's unacceptable. So the kohen actually needs to be entirely inside of the courtyard when he receives the blood. He doesn't need to be there when he shafts. As long as the animal is shafted there, it's fine. But for receiving the blood, he needs to be entirely inside. As the verse says, when you come to the tent of meeting that you've got to be inside. When you come in. Okay. If in the convulsive movements that accompanied its death, the animal moved out of the courtyard, but after the blood was already received, then it is acceptable. Because even if the fats and organs to be offered on the altar, the meats of sacrifices of a lesser degree of sanctity were taken outside the courtyard, before the blood was presented on the altar, it's acceptable, as will be explained. So again, the shchita, when he shafts it, the animal needs to be on the inside. When he receives the blood, everyone needs to be on the inside. But if the meat goes out the courtyard, that's not a problem. Halacha number 14. If the entire body of such an animal was inside the courtyard, except for its foot, which was outside while it was being shafted, it's unacceptable. So not only does the shchita, the shafting itself, need to be in the courtyard, but the animal in its entirety needs to be too, as the pasuk says, and they shall be brought to Hashem, implied that they are entirely brought to Hashem, entirely in the courtyard. Okay, so if he shafted it and the animal was inside in its entirety, and after the shchita, it moved its feet outside, this gets interesting. You should cut off the meat until it reaches the bone, and afterwards the blood should be received. So earlier we spoke about if the animal went outside after the blood was received. But if the animal jumped out after it was shafted, before the blood was received, so he wants to be sure that whatever blood he's receiving is coming from inside, not the outside. So what he'll need to do is to actually remove, without breaking a bone, which is forbidden, any limb that left the courtyard, and only then receive the blood. That way he's sure that the blood that he's receiving is from the animal that's on the inside. If you receive the blood and afterwards cut off the meat, it's disqualified, as we just discussed, because it means that the blood is also coming from the outside. With regards to a sacrifice of a lesser degree of sanctity, then there's no need to cut off the meat. Instead, you should bring its foot back into the temple courtyard and receive the blood. For even if meat sacrifices of a lesser degree of sanctity actually were removed from the courtyard before the blood was cast on the altar, the sacrifice is acceptable. Okay, if a person hung the animal above the earth and shafted it, airborne. So it's in the free space of the courtyard, but it's not actually on the ground. It's unacceptable. As the Torah says, on the flank of the altar, implying that one must slaughter it on the ground. So nowadays, I think there may be at least I know in South Africa, the way shchita, the way slaughtering is done, is the animal standing on the ground, but they just have a brace that comes around the animal to stop it from moving. It just holds it in place. It just it's like a brace that moves in just before he shafts it and holds it in place. In other places, I think it could be that they actually turn the animal over first. And may even have it, I don't want to say, never mind. But the point is that regularly when you shaft an animal, if it was hanging, it's kosher. But I say hanging, I mean by its hands and feet, not any other way. But for an offering, it has to be on the ground. Now, if the animal was on the ground, but the sheikhet was hanging, sure, this is getting creative. The sheikhet is now hanging from the roof while he's shafting the animal. The animal is disqualified if it is of the higher level of holiness. If it's an animal of the lower level of holiness, even if the sheikhet is airborne, the animal is acceptable. If a person only shechted a minority of the neck of the pipes that needed to be shechted outside of the courtyard, and then he completed the shchita once it was inside the courtyard, or that's for an animal of lower level of holiness. So if it was an animal of a higher level of holiness, where we said it needs to be in the courtyard, and he started the shefting it, he shefted a minimal amount of the pipes while it was outside of its place, out the courtyard, and then he completed the shechita once it was inside the courtyard, then these offerings are acceptable. Sorry? They are unacceptable. Why? Because shefting an animal is considered one continuous act, and therefore it needs to be done in the right place from beginning to end. Okay. Now, if the sheikhet was okay, so now so we've spoken about the animal being airborne, and that's a problem. We've spoken about the sheikhet being airborne, and that also being a problem. Did we say it's a problem? Yes. Now we move on to the next step, which is the person that receives the blood in a cup to be sprinkled on the altar. If that guy was hanging, if he was airborne, then it is also disqualified, because it's not the matter of temple service. We don't do things hanging in the air. What's his name? David Koppelman or something, that illusionist. So if he got your kohen to be hanging, then that's not the way things work in the base of English, except apparently that's just an illusion. Anyhow, moving along. Illusions probably would work. I don't know. We could debate that afterwards. If one was standing in the courtyard and hung a cup over his arm and received the blood in the air. So now the cup, he's standing, but the cup is hanging. Or lifted the animal and thus received the blood in the air, it is acceptable. For the open space above the place is considered to be the space itself. So as long as the animal's grounded and you're grounded, if your cups are not grounded, then your cup needs to be grounded. But if the cup is not grounded, that's not a problem. So if you've got some flying saucers, then that's not a problem. Okay. If one placed one receptacle within a second receptacle and received the blood, you had a cup and a cup. It reminds me, there was once a chassid that came to a rebbe, and he came with these fancy boots. Kind of long story short, the rebbe said to him, I've seen feet in boots. Galoshen in Yiddish, in Russian or Yiddish is boots. But a cup in Galoshen, but to have your head in your boots, that I've never seen. So here, if you had your cup in a cup or a cup in a cup, or actually here we're just talking about CUPs and CUPs, cups and cups, then it is acceptable. Why? Because they're both of the same substance, and therefore they're not considered an interruption. If one placed fibers inside of the cup and received the blood, again, the reception is acceptable because the fibers are porous and thus the blood descends into the receptacle without any interference. If, however, one does this while taking a handful of flour from a meal offering and took the handful without fibers, it is unacceptable because while fibers won't get in the way of a liquid, they will get in the way of the flour. And we don't want an intervening substance. Okay, receiving the blood of a sacrificial animal, receiving it. Number 2, bringing it to the altar. Number 3, casting it on the altar. And number 4, bringing the limbs to the ramp are all tasks that are only acceptable if performed by a kohen, fit to serve. So to shecht the animal, anybody can do. But to receive the blood, bring the blood, sprinkle the blood, and bring the limbs has to be done by a kohen that's allowed to serve. As we explained with regard to taking a handful of flour from a meal offering or snipping off the head of a fowl. Now, bringing blood or limbs to the altar in a way other than walking is not considered bringing them. Therefore, if a kohen receives the blood and while standing in that place casts it on the altar, is disqualified. So he actually needs to walk if he just received it over there and then sprinkled it over there without actually walking, it's disqualified. An integral, there are 4 steps: receiving, walking, sprinkling, and bringing the limbs. And if it missed that second step, if he went straight from receiving to sprinkling without walking, it's disqualified. If the kohen received the blood with his right hand and then passed the cup to his left hand, he should put it back in his right hand. If he received the blood in an ordinary vessel, then the animal is disqualified. It has to be received in a vessel that qualifies. If he received it in the sacred vessel, transferred it to an ordinary vessel, then he can transfer it back to a holy vessel. So as long as it's received in a holy vessel, even if subsequently it's transferred, it could always be transferred back. Now, if the blood spilled out of the receptacle onto the floor, we have a spill over here. Blood has been spilled and is still acceptable if one gathers up the blood. If, however, it's spilled out from the neck of the animal to the ground and then he collected it with a cup, then that's disqualified because it needs to go straight from the animal into the cup. So once it landed in the cup, if subsequently it's spilled that he was able to regather it, then that's fine. Now, if some of the blood of the neck spilled to the ground and was not received in a cup, and then the kohen managed to receive the remaining blood in the cup, then it is acceptable, provided the blood that was received is the animal's lifeblood and not blood concentrated in the limbs that come, or the blood, the skin that comes thereafter. So if some of the blood spilled, as long as he still catches some of that original blood in a cup, then he still fulfills one of those 4 steps of an offering: receiving, walking, sprinkling, and bringing the limbs. Now, if any of the individuals who are unacceptable to perform temple service receive the blood, or bring the blood to the altar, or sprinkle on the altar as required by law, the animal is disqualified. If a kohen who is acceptable for such service receives the blood and he gives it to someone who's unacceptable, but the latter didn't walk with it, instead he stayed in his place, so he could give it back to the kohen that is acceptable, as long as he didn't do one of those 4 steps. But if the unacceptable person carried it towards the altar, he did that second step of bringing the blood over and then gave it back to the kohen, then the animal is and even if the kohen then went and carried it, since the blood was carried by somebody that's unacceptable, whether at the beginning or the end, the animal is disqualified. You cannot correct that. Okay, I see we've hit 1:30. Let's see if we could run through the last few halachas, at least briefly. Okay, so if blood was received by an unacceptable person, so if there's still blood, life blood that remains, then an acceptable kohen can receive that and then do the rest of the steps, and the animal will still be acceptable, because the fact that somebody unacceptable received the blood doesn't disqualify what's left. Except for somebody who's impure. Since he is fit to carry out temple service, if the animal would have been brought to the state of impurity, which we've learned about elsewhere, that if everybody's impure, then everything would be done in impurity, which has a connection to Chanukah. We won't speak about that now due to time constraints. So then he causes the blood that still has, so if somebody that was impure received a little bit of the blood, then the rest of the blood is considered left over and disqualified. Okay. 29. But even the slightest substance is taken from one of the animal's limbs after it was shechted, but before its blood was cast on the altar, it's disqualified. Even if one merely mutilated the ear of an animal before the blood was received, the animal is disqualified. Meaning that because when he receives the blood, the bull needs to be completely intact. Although we had one exception. We said if part of the foot went outside of the courtyard, that he would, or outside of the correct area, he would remove that before receiving the blood. I guess that's different. If, however, its substance was reduced after the blood was received, but before the blood was cast on the altar, even if the meat was lost before the blood was cast on the altar, or it was consumed by fire, and he should still cast the blood on the altar as long as at least an olive-sized portion of the meat remains. If not even that remains, then he should not cast the blood on the altar because everything's been disqualified. With regards to a burnt offering, even if half an olive size of the portion of the meat or half an olive size of the organs and fats remain, he still can cast the blood on the altar. If less than an olive sized portion of a burnt offering remains, the blood should not be cast on the altar. If it is cast on the altar, then the sacrifice is not received with favor. If the meat is disqualified before the blood is cast on the altar, or it was taken out of the temple courtyard, the blood should not be cast. If it was, however, then the offering is favorable. But the meat of a sacrifice of a lesser degree of sanctity was taken out of the courtyard before the blood was cast on the altar. Even though the blood was cast on the altar while the meat was outside, the offering is acceptable because ultimately the meat is going to be taken outside to be burned. Casting the blood on the altar is effective with regards to the obligation to have the sacrificial meat, which was taken out of the temple courtyard, burned, but not to have it permitted to be eaten. So if the blood is cast on the altar, that would allow an offering that's usually burned to be burned, but not one that's eaten to be eaten if it was done in the incorrect way. Similarly, when the organs and fats to be offered on the altar from sacrifices of a lesser degree of sanctity were taken out of the courtyard before the blood was cast on the altar, the sacrifice is not disqualified. If they were returned to the temple courtyard, they should be offered. Even if they were not returned, one is liable for violating the transgression against partaking of pickle or noiser or impure meat if he partakes of them. So the meat's disqualified, but the animal is still acceptable. Finally, the last 4 halachas. With regards to any offering brought by a private person, whether the meat became impure but the facts are intact, okay, Tati is for or the fats became impure but the meat is intact, the blood should still be cast on the altar. If they both became impure, both the meat and the fats, then it should not be cast, but if it was, the animal is still received with favor. For the high priest's 4 plates atones for this. Similarly, when fats and organs to be offered on the altar's pyre or the limbs of a burnt offering became impure and they were nonetheless offered on the altar, then the Kohen Gadol's forehead plate atones for that. With regards to any of the communal offerings, even if all of the meat and its fats became impure, the blood should still be cast on the altar. When the blood of a sacrificial animal was taken outside of the courtyard, the sacrifice is disqualified. So now we're not talking about removing the limbs, but we're talking about removing the blood. If the blood was removed from its place, the animal is disqualified, even if it was brought back. No blood from korbanos is acceptable to ritual impurity at all. As the Torah says with regards to the blood, you shall pour it on the earth like water, meaning the blood which is poured out like water is considered as water and is susceptible to ritual impurity. The blood of sacrificial animals, by contrast, is not poured out like water and is not susceptible to impurity. So it actually can't become impure, the blood of a sacrificial animal. Finally, 37, if the sun sets and the blood from an offering has not yet been cast on the altar, the animal is disqualified. And now for the questions. This is a tough one. May a non-kohen shecht a sacrifice of the most sacred order? Yes, no, or maybe?
Yes.
I think yes.
1 second.